Hello, my name's Paul Edmondson. I'm Head of Research for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust.
And I'm Stanley Wells. I'm Honorary President of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust.
And we're here to talk about the Shakespeare Circle and Alternative Biography. We're here at the Shakespeare Centre, and we thought we'd begin by asking you to judge our book by its cover. There's a wonderful image of a ring with a WS on it. The ring's just below us in this cabinet here on special display. It was found in a field near Holy Trinity Church on the 16th of March, 1810. And there is a strong claim that it might be the ring that was once on the finger of William Shakespeare.
Well, is it or isn't it? Michael Wood, the historian who contributes a chapter to our book, made a very interesting connection when he realised that Shakespeare may have lost his ring, as he writes, close to the church after his daughter Judith's wedding on the 10th of February 1616, and he justifies this by saying that in Shakespeare's will, the phrase, "whereof I have hereunto put my hand and seal," was altered by substituting the word hand for seal, which was crossed out, which supports the suggestion that he'd lost his ring, with which, of course, he would have made the seal.
So this WS seal ring allows us to, as it were, represent symbolically the Shakespeare Circle on the front of the book, but it also brings together different kinds of evidence in a similar way in which we've invited our contributors to use known facts. For example, it brings together an historical moment. Somebody lost this ring. It brings together documentary evidence because of Shakespeare's will. It brings together expertise, the local historian Robert Wheeler and others who've studied the ring. We know it's the ring of the period, it's 22 karat gold. And we know also the fourth thing is that it's an artifact, whosever it was, that requires explanation. And that's why it's on the front of the Shakespeare Circle. The Shakespeare Circle brings together 25 individual contributors from the international world of Shakespeare studies, and everyone is writing about people in Shakespeare's life we know he was closest to. It's a circle about connections, about neighbourhoods, about how people lived, about how Shakespeare went through daily life, really.
Yes, the circle is all the people that he knew, the people, his relatives, his friends in Stratford, his friends in London, his associates, his colleagues in London. Quite a wide circle of people.
Well, we're here in Anne Hathaway's cottage, Anne Shakespeare, and our contributor, Catherine Shield from the University of Minnesota, writes that she was the closest member of the Shakespeare Circle, his wife. And there's been a lot of renewed interest in Anne Shakespeare in recent times. Her family connections, the way she was trusted with money in 1602. She was left some money for the poor from a family shepherd here at Shottery, Thomas Whittington. Her competency in running the cottage industries at New Place in Stratford, how she made money in her own right. These sorts of things help us to look afresh at her life as just one example. We were delighted that Germaine Greer was one of the contributors because she was able to write about Judith Quiney, Shakespeare's daughter.
Yes, Shakespeare's daughter has a fascinating life. She was, we don't know much about her education, though she must have had some education, but there was a scandal around her shortly about her marriage, very shortly before Shakespeare died, and there's every reason to believe that Shakespeare altered his will because she was marrying somebody who just had an extramarital affair with a woman called Margaret Wheeler, by whom he had a child, and both of them died as a result of that. So Judith Shakespeare was a particularly fascinating lady, especially also because she lived well into her 70s. If only somebody had gone and asked her a lot of interesting questions about her father later in her life, we'd all be very grateful. We're now in Wilmcote, 3 miles out of Stratford, and we're in the environment in which Mary Shakespeare, Mary Arden as she was born, lived. Here she lived, here she helped her father.
And we think of Mary Shakespeare as being one of the first to inspire Shakespeare's young imagination with the stories she told him at her knee. Bevis of Southampton, Guy of Warwick, King Arthur, Robin Hood. These were all part of the oral traditions. They were easily available in cheaply printed books.
And many of them are referred to in Shakespeare's own plays.
Yeah, the sense that it's a long memory that he has of these things
Yeah.
that come up years later in his own work. But then, as Shakespeare grows up, he buys this big house, New Place, in the centre of Stratford, and it's reasonable to suppose that there was plenty of space there for all of his family. His own children, his own 3 children, his wife, maybe his parents, his brothers who never married, and you can imagine them all living in New Place quite easily. Also, they had lodgers, Thomas Green and his wife and their 2 children, and it's very likely New Place where Mary Arden, Mary Shakespeare died in 1608. And that sense of the circle widening, that sense of the family gathering in a place and living there. Stratford at the time having good links to London as well. So all of these things, in imagining the life of Shakespeare's mother, move her from a country girl upbringing into a busy town, and all that Shakespeare's achieving as well.
It's an alternative biography in the sense that instead of taking a cradle-to-grave approach, as all the standard Shakespeare biographies do, we look at the periphery of Shakespeare's life. We look at the moons who circled around the sun that was William Shakespeare. We look at the people he knew, members of his family, his business associates, his fellow actors, his publishers, and so on. We look at it both from the Stratford and the London point of view. We think about all these people whose lives reflected his, and we try to look at the degree to which his own life is illuminated by the environment in which he was brought up, the people he knew, the people he worked with, the friends, and finally, in the later part of his life, of course, his collaborators, the people with whom he worked.
If you imagine it in our own terms, all the people around us who enhance our lives daily, who we meet, the kinds of things we talk about.
Time Stratford was a market town. It had about 2,000 inhabitants. The actual plan of the town was very much as it still is, with main streets going down to the river and crisscross streets there too. It had been full of market stalls down Bridge Street, the street towards the bridge, the very fine bridge which had been built in the previous century by the Clopton family, the Great Stone Bridge. The town was on the river, of course. The river was important to the town's economy. People came here from other places to sell their goods, to bring their cheese, their eggs, their poultry and so on to market here. And it was full of tradesmen. It had a great school, of course, and the school is very important. The school is still here, King Edward VI School, which Shakespeare would no doubt attended, which had very fine headmasters coming from Oxford and so on. It had also important links with London. People would go to and fro from London on horseback, of course, normally. There was a carrier called Mr. Greenaway. We know about Mr. Greenaway. And he would go 2 or 3 times a week, perhaps, to London and bring back spices, books and whatnot for the local inhabitants. So it had important links with the metropolis.
One of the important links with Shakespeare and the town of Stratford was his great house of New Place, which he purchased in 1597. And his lodger there, Thomas Green, was town clerk. He took the minutes of the town council meeting, which was almost next door, just across the street in the Guildhall. Thomas Green was from, as it were, has connections with London because he trained at the Middle Temple. He was a legal expert and moved within that circle of other legal minds who knew Shakespeare, for example, John Manningham, who was also connected to the Middle Temple. The other thing about Shakespeare in Stratford is the investments that he made in the town and where his money came from. And the land that he's buying, the real estate he's buying in Stratford, really root him in the town. At the moment, we're in the house of John Hall, the physician who was Shakespeare's son-in-law. And the article in the book is written by a medical doctor himself, Greg Wells. And he's looked again at Hall's casebook and what that tells us, and his son-in-law's relationship to Shakespeare. He was married to Susanna, and they lived in this house, now known as Hall's Croft, from about 1613. We're here in Holy Trinity Church. Behind me is the last resting place of William Shakespeare. It's a place where he was baptised in 1564 and where members of his family were, a place he knew well growing up. book, as it were, is full of incidental surprises, nuggets of information which are presented afresh within the context of these different lives around Shakespeare. But people may be surprised to know that had Shakespeare died in London, the chances are he'd have been buried in Westminster Abbey. There was a precedent for that with Francis Beaumont, another of the playwrights of the time, and other writers. But he's here just behind us. The monument refers to him as a writer. The monument was installed sometime between 1616 and 1623. Of course, there was a Puritan vicar in Stratford from 1619. It's unlikely he'd have allowed the brightly coloured bust to have been installed. Those sorts of deeply contextual bits of information, we hope, spring to life afresh across the pages. But of course, the Westminster Abbey suggestion also highlights Shakespeare's social status by the end of his life.
Yes, and I think one of the more surprising essays in the volume is that which suggests that Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, didn't become impoverished halfway through his life and give up his civic career because of that, but that he actually made a lot of money on the side as a wool dealer and withdrew from public life so that he could increase his personal fortunes. And that relates very interestingly and originally, I think, to Shakespeare's own purchases. As you know, he bought throughout his career. He made major investments, mostly in the Stratford area. So I think we're increasingly coming to think of Shakespeare as a Stratford man. We've been recently doing archaeological investigations in the house that he bought in 1597 in New Place, and we write, of course, about those in the book. And New Thought about New Place suggests that Shakespeare was really quite a wealthy householder here, second only, I think, to the Combe family, about whom I write, who lived just off bounds of the Stratford borough in the College, as it was called, which was the biggest house in the area, but not the biggest house in the borough of Stratford, which was Shakespeare's own.
Another surprise might be that his daughter Susanna could possibly have written Latin, because the inscription on her mother's grave just behind us, Anne Shakespeare, is in Latin, but it calls her mother. It's written from the perspective of a child, which means, presumably, if that's true, Shakespeare taught Susanna Latin, and her epitaph behind us says that she was witty above her sex, but that's not all. Wise to salvation was good Mistress Hall. Something of Shakespeare was in that. To accompany the book, we've made available a free digital platform called the ShakespeareCircle.com, which is presented in partnership with Cambridge University Press, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and has been built for us by Misfit Incorporated. It gathers together soundposts, imagined first-person accounts of 28 of the subjects mentioned in the book, the voices, as it were, from Shakespeare's own life. The graves of some of these are behind us, including his daughter Susanna, his wife Anne, his son-in-law John, and his grandson-in-law Thomas Nash, as well as Shakespeare himself. Of course, he doesn't speak on the digital platform. That would contravene the intention of the book. It's about the people around him.
Yes, the soundposts which we've written between us each lasts between perhaps 2 to 3 minutes, little imagined monologues, rather in the style of Alan Bennett's Talking Heads, for example. We tried to make them quite jokey and accessible, trying to pick out some of the more important ways in which they relate to the essays in the book about these people. And they've been spoken, some of them are spoken by distinguished actors, Jane Lapotaire, Barbara Lee Hunt, Henry Goodman, for example, others by ourselves and by our colleagues in Stratford here.